Imagine a stranger who arrives in town driving a beat-up old car, facing whispers and laughter from those who judge him at first glance. But what happens when, the very next day, he returns? Not in that old car, but stepping out of his own private jet. And what if, in that moment, he reveals a lesson that will change the town forever? Stick around to see how this stranger's unexpected actions leave a lasting impact. And if you enjoy stories with powerful lessons, make sure to subscribe and join us for more unforgettable tales. An elderly black man drove his worn-out car down the familiar street, the engine rumbling softly as he pulled up to the local diner. It was an old sedan, with faded paint, a dented bumper, and a slight squeak each time he opened the door. As he stepped out, his calm, steady presence seemed out of place next to the car's rough edges, drawing glances from others around. A few young men standing by couldn't help but snicker as they exchanged looks, nudging each other and muttering under their breath. He noticed them but said nothing, his face calm and unbothered, as if he hadn't heard the remarks floating through the air. He stood for a moment, straightening his jacket before heading inside, moving with the kind of quiet dignity that comes from years of life experience. But the men weren't done. They threw loud, sarcastic comments his way, joking about old beaters and hinting he'd never see anything better. Others around joined in, chuckling, their laughter echoing through the parking lot. He paused for a brief moment, his gaze drifting to the group with a look that was hard to read, almost a mixture of amusement and patience. With a calm nod to himself, he walked inside, ignoring the jabs and whispers that followed him. Inside, he greeted the cashier warmly and placed his usual order, a simple coffee and a toasted sandwich. He sat down by the window, sipping slowly as he looked out, his gaze steady, focused. People around the diner occasionally shot him quick glances, sizing him up, whispering among themselves. But he simply looked out the window, watching the world move by, as though he hadn't a care in the world. Though he didn't react, there was a slight sadness in his eyes, a reflection of years of experiences, perhaps times when he'd faced similar judgment. As he sipped his coffee and looked out the window, memories seemed to drift across his face, flickers of a life filled with hard work, challenges, and choices few knew about. The old car outside wasn't just a vehicle. It was a quiet symbol of his journey, a reminder of times when he'd had to fight to get by and make things work with little to spare. It would have been easy for him to replace it, but he kept it for reasons of his own, reasons that went deeper than appearances. He was a man who didn't put much weight on outward shows of wealth. He had learned long ago that a car, a house, or a suit of clothes didn't define a person's worth. As he sat quietly in the diner, the young men from outside strolled in, laughing loudly, and took a seat at a nearby booth. They didn't stop their remarks, tossing loud jokes his way about people who were too cheap to buy a new car or pretending to be something they're not. The others in the diner looked over, some amused, others uncomfortable, but no one said a word to stop them. The man remained silent, keeping his eyes on his coffee, but the faint lines around his mouth tightened, as if he'd heard this sort of talk many times before. It didn't hurt him exactly, not in the way the young men hoped it would. It just reminded him of how easily people judged one another, how they saw only what was right in front of them without looking any deeper. The waitress brought him his sandwich, casting him an apologetic look, as though she wanted to say something to make him feel better, but he simply smiled at her, a warm, reassuring smile that seemed to tell her not to worry. He ate slowly, calmly, not reacting even as the young men's laughter grew louder, filling the small diner with their mocking tone. To them, he was just an old man who couldn't afford anything better. They couldn't imagine that maybe he had chosen his car for reasons they wouldn't understand. But as he sat there, a thought passed through his mind. Tomorrow would be different. He glanced back out the window, a slight smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, barely noticeable but hinting at something beneath his calm expression. He had no anger toward the young men, no resentment. Instead, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, as if he knew something they didn't. With a final sip of his coffee, he set his cup down, left a tip on the table, and stood to leave. The young men watched him as he headed for the door, whispering and laughing amongst themselves, unaware that they were about to see something that would change their perception entirely. He walked back to his car, his movement slow but steady, each step deliberate. He opened the door, the hinges squeaking just as before, and climbed in without a glance backward. He drove away quietly, leaving the young men still snickering in the diner, convinced that they'd seen all there was to know about him. But he knew better. Tomorrow, he would give them something they would never forget. The next morning, the sun rose over the quiet town, casting long golden rays across the streets and warming the sidewalks. People were just starting their day, and the diner was slowly coming to life as the usual morning crowd shuffled in. Conversations filled the air with the familiar sounds of breakfast orders, the clatter of plates and the low hum of voices. The young men from the previous day returned as well, their laughter and loud jokes as grating as ever. They glanced around, noticing the absence of the old man's beat-up car in the lot. One of them chuckled, nudging the others and saying, "Guess he finally figured he didn't belong here." They ordered their food, chatting and laughing as though nothing had happened, entirely unaware that something unusual was brewing in the air. Outside, the morning crowd grew larger, with people pausing and craning their necks, looking up at the sky. A distant low hum could be heard, getting louder and louder, until it was unmistakably the sound of a jet engine. The young men paused, looking up, squinting out the diner windows. The sound grew closer until, in an open field just beyond the diner, a sleek silver private jet descended, glistening in the morning sun as it gently touched down. A hush fell over the diner as everyone rushed to the windows, eyes wide with curiosity and amazement. The young men leaned forward, pressing their faces to the glass, unable to believe what they were seeing. For a moment they wondered if someone famous was coming to town, someone important or wealthy. Whispers filled the room as people exchanged guesses, each wilder than the last. But as the jet's door opened and the stairs unfolded, a figure began to emerge, moving down the steps with a quiet grace and confidence that commanded attention. To their utter shock, it was the old man, the same elderly black man they had mocked and jeered at just the day before. He descended from the jet with the same calm expression they had seen before, his eyes steady and his posture dignified. There was no arrogance in his steps, no smugness. He looked around as if nothing were out of the ordinary, his face composed, as though this was just another part of his day. The young men froze, speechless, as the realization sank in. Their laughter had died on their lips, replaced by a stunned silence that hung heavily in the air. People murmured in awe as he stepped onto the ground, nodding politely to those gathered nearby. He moved with a quiet elegance, dressed simply but sharply, exuding a quiet power and confidence that needed no explanation. The whispers grew louder as the townspeople realized that the man they had often overlooked was someone of considerable means and influence. Every pair of eyes in the diner was glued to him, the crowd unable to tear themselves away from this shocking twist. The young men stared, their expressions a mix of embarrassment, disbelief, and a tinge of regret. They watched him make his way slowly, purposefully, toward the diner, realizing that the man they had mocked for his beat-up car was more than they could ever have imagined. Each step he took toward them was a silent reminder of their mistake, of the foolishness in judging someone by what little they could see. As he neared the door, he paused briefly, glancing up at the young men who stood frozen by the window. He met their eyes for a moment, giving them a small, knowing nod, a gesture that seemed to say more than any words could. It was a look that carried the weight of experience, of wisdom, of a life lived fully and without need for anyone's approval. Then, without a word, he opened the door and stepped inside, leaving the young men to stew in their own stunned silence. They exchanged uneasy glances, each of them wondering how they could have been so blind to the real strength that lay within him. Inside the diner, the buzz of excitement and disbelief was electric. People whispered in hushed tones, stealing glances at the old man as he quietly took his usual seat by the window, as though nothing had changed. The waitress approached him, her usual smile now tinged with awe, her hands almost shaking as she poured his coffee. "Good morning, sir," she managed, her voice filled with a newfound respect that hadn't been there the day before. He thanked her with a polite nod, his face as calm as ever, showing no hint of satisfaction or pride. To him, this was no spectacle, just another morning. As he lifted his coffee to his lips, the young men from yesterday slowly made their way to his table, their earlier bravado nowhere to be seen. They approached hesitantly, their heads slightly bowed, unsure how to begin. The leader of the group, the one who had laughed the loudest, took a deep breath and cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, his voice a bit shaky, "we didn't realize. We didn't know who you were." The old man looked up at them, his gaze gentle but firm. His silence stretched for a moment, and they felt the weight of it pressing down on them, a silent rebuke for their actions. Finally, he set his coffee cup down and spoke, his tone calm and steady. "Who I am," he said, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Son, I am just a man who knows what really matters in life. You all saw an old car and assumed you knew everything about me. But a car doesn't make a person, nor does a suit or a fancy house. True worth, it's something you can't measure by what a man owns." The young men fidgeted uncomfortably, their eyes cast downward, ashamed and unable to meet his gaze. His words struck deep, stripping away their assumptions and forcing them to confront their own shallow judgments. They realized how wrong they had been, how they had let appearances cloud their understanding of a man who was clearly wiser and stronger than they could comprehend. The old man continued, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable strength. "I learned long ago that you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. People will always have opinions, will always make judgments. But your value is in what you do, in the choices you make every day." He paused, letting the words sink in before he added, "Remember that." One of the young men, unable to contain his shame, finally managed a quiet, "We're sorry, sir. We shouldn't have judged you like that." The man gave them a kind nod, his face softening as he replied, "I appreciate that, son. Just remember this lesson. Sometimes the things that don't shine on the outside carry the brightest light within." With that, he turned his attention back to his coffee, signaling the end of the conversation. The young men murmured their apologies once more before retreating to their table, their minds reeling from the unexpected lesson they had learned. The young men returned to their booth, their laughter and smugness now completely gone, replaced by quiet contemplation. They barely touched their food, each of them lost in thought, replaying the old man's words over and over in their minds. It was as though he had peeled back a layer of their world, revealing something they'd never considered, that the worth of a person had nothing to do with money or status, but with character, choices, and dignity. Outside, the private jet gleamed in the morning light, a silent reminder of just how wrong they had been in their assumptions. One of the young men, the one who had started the mockery in the first place, glanced out at the jet, still struggling to wrap his mind around the fact that the man they had mocked had access to such wealth. He remembered the old, beat-up car, the faded paint, the gentle, unassuming way the man had carried himself. Nothing had hinted at his true status. Yet now the jet symbolized a world far beyond their own. After a while, one of them spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think he's, like, super rich?" His question hung in the air, but the usual excitement or envy one might feel at the thought of wealth wasn't there. Instead, there was a sense of respect and even a bit of humility. They had always thought that wealth came with flaunting it, with flashy cars, big houses, and designer clothes. But here was a man who had all of that and more, yet chose to keep it hidden, valuing something beyond material things. Their leader, who had been the loudest and most arrogant the day before, shook his head, sighing. "It's not just about money, though, is it?" he murmured. "That guy, he's got something we don't even understand." Another young man who had been silent this whole time nodded slowly. Dignity, he said quietly. It's like he didn't need our approval. He didn't even care what we thought of him. He was just comfortable with himself. How many people can really say that? Their words drifted off as they glanced across the diner at the man, still sitting calmly by the window, sipping his coffee with a quiet confidence that now seemed even more remarkable. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't out to prove a point. He was simply living in a way that honored himself, in a way that felt true to who he was. The young men realized that they had missed what made him remarkable. It wasn't his car, his wealth, or even his jet. It was his ability to rise above judgment, to let his life speak for itself. One of them leaned forward, his tone thoughtful. You know, maybe we should talk to him. I mean, really talk to him. Ask him about his life, what he's learned. There's probably a lot we could learn from a guy like that. But as they looked over at the old man, they saw him standing up, placing a few bills on the table as a tip, and nodding politely to the waitress. He seemed ready to leave, and in that moment the young men felt a pang of regret. They had had the chance to learn from him, to hear the wisdom he carried, but they had been too busy mocking him, too caught up in their own shallow judgments to see the value right in front of them. They watched as he walked toward the door, each step carrying that same calm grace, that quiet strength they now admired. Suddenly, almost impulsively, the leader of the group stood up, calling out, "Sir, wait." The old man stopped, turning back to face them, his expression patient but questioning. The young man hesitated, fumbling for words. We just wanted to thank you for what you said earlier. I think we all needed to hear that." His voice was sincere, stripped of the arrogance and bravado it had carried the day before. The old man gave them a small smile, one filled with understanding. He nodded, his gaze warm but steady. "Son," he said softly, "life has a way of teaching us what we need to know, sometimes when we least expect it. Just remember, respect costs nothing, and it often gives back more than you can imagine." With those words, he gave them a final nod and walked out the door. The young men stood there watching as he stepped outside, moving toward his jet, the quiet grace of his departure lingering in the air. They stayed by the window, feeling a strange mix of awe, respect, and even gratitude. The experience had humbled them in a way they hadn't expected. They had looked down on the man for his beat-up car, yet now they understood that he had something they could only hope to achieve: inner peace, humility, and the wisdom to know what really mattered. As they watched him board the jet, disappearing into its sleek interior, they felt a powerful shift within themselves. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was a lesson, a turning point, and as the jet lifted off into the sky, they realized they would carry this lesson with them long after that day. As the old man's jet disappeared into the morning sky, a quiet stillness settled over the diner, the hum of conversation subdued as everyone reflected on what they'd just witnessed. The young men sat back down, each one feeling the weight of the experience, a heaviness they hadn't expected. They'd come to the diner like any other day, laughing and carefree, unaware that by the end of breakfast, their views would be turned upside down by a single, unassuming stranger. One of the young men, still watching the sky where the jet had vanished, shook his head slowly, lost in thought. "You know, I never really thought about it before. I mean, how we just judge people. I've done it 1,000 times, looking at what someone drives, what they wear, where they live. But that guy..." He trailed off, struggling to put the feeling into words. Another chimed in, nodding. "He didn't need any of it, did he? I mean, he had a private jet, for crying out loud. But he showed up here in that car like it didn't matter at all. Can you imagine? He was right. None of that stuff actually makes you better than anyone else." Their leader sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him as he looked down at the table. The arrogance he'd carried the day before had faded, replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. "It's weird," he admitted. "I feel like I owe him something, you know. We spent so much time making fun of him and he didn't even get angry. He just taught us a lesson without saying much at all. The others nodded in agreement, the impact of the old man's words settling over them. They realized that the lesson hadn't been about his wealth, his status, or his possessions. It was about dignity, humility, and the ability to stay true to oneself, no matter what others might think. The old man's quiet strength had left a mark on them, something deeper and more lasting than the flash of his jet or the surprise of his wealth. After a while, they decided to leave the diner, still feeling the echoes of the lesson they had learned. As they walked down the street, each of them seemed a little quieter, their steps slower, more thoughtful. They passed by cars, houses, and people, but for the first time they weren't just seeing the surface. They were looking a little deeper, wondering about the lives and stories hidden behind each face, each appearance. In the days that followed, the young men found themselves thinking back on the encounter again and again. It stayed with them, like a pebble in their shoe, reminding them of how quick they had been to judge. The old man's words would surface in their minds at unexpected moments, a reminder to treat others with respect, to look beyond the obvious, to value what truly mattered. And slowly, those words began to change them. They stopped making jokes at others' expense, stopped sneering at people who looked different or drove older cars or wore simpler clothes. They learned to listen more, to give people the benefit of the doubt. It wasn't an overnight change, but the old man's influence ran deep, shaping their actions, their thoughts, their understanding of the world. One afternoon, they found themselves back at the diner, the same place where they'd once laughed at the old man, now transformed into a place of quiet reflection. They sat at their usual booth, watching as people came and went, each of them feeling the difference within themselves. They spoke quietly, sharing memories of the encounter, marveling at how one man, one simple moment, had shifted their lives in such a profound way. It was then that they made a silent promise, each in his own heart. They would carry forward the old man's lesson. They would remember to look beyond appearances, to see the worth in every person they met. And perhaps in their own small ways they would pass on the lesson, showing others what they had learned through kindness, respect, and humility. As they left the diner, a lightness in their step, they knew that they were no longer the same young men who had laughed so carelessly. They had been changed, transformed by a stranger who needed no validation, who had simply shown them the way by being true to himself. And they understood now, more than ever, that true wealth, true success was something far greater than what could be seen on the outside. It was a strength of spirit, a richness of heart, a quiet confidence that needed no explanation. And with that understanding, they walked out into the world, a little wiser, a little kinder, ready to carry forward the legacy of a man who had left them with a gift they could never repay, a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new way of living. As the days turned into weeks, the young men found themselves returning to their daily lives, but things felt different. That brief encounter had left a lasting mark on them, an impression they hadn't expected, and it colored the way they approached the world. Friends noticed the change in them, how they listened more, how they were more considerate, even with strangers. They stopped gossiping about others' appearances or choices, and instead, they carried themselves with a newfound respect and maturity. One afternoon, while sitting in the park, they overheard a group of teenagers laughing and mocking an elderly woman with worn-out clothes and scuffed shoes. Without even thinking, the young men shared a look and approached the teens, gently but firmly intervening. "Hey," one of them said, "you don't know what she's been through. Maybe she's been places and seen things we can't even imagine." The teens looked confused, a little embarrassed, and shuffled off, their laughter replaced by an uneasy silence. As they watched the woman continue on her way, the young men felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing they had done what the old man would have done, choosing kindness and respect over judgment. They realized that every person they encountered held a story, and that story deserved to be respected, even if they would never know it fully. It wasn't long before people in the community began to take notice of them too. Neighbors commented on how these young men, once quick to make fun, now showed a surprising kindness and maturity. It was subtle, but unmistakable, and it touched those around them. They became known not as the loud, thoughtless group they had once been, but as young men with integrity, men who showed respect and care to everyone they met. One day, as they were passing by the diner, they spotted a familiar figure standing in the parking lot, looking out over the town with a serene expression. It was the old man. He was leaning casually against his beat-up car, his presence as calm and steady as ever, as though he had never left. He glanced up and saw them, a small smile of recognition crossing his face. The young men walked over, a bit nervous but eager to let him know what he had done for them. They thanked him, each taking a turn to express how much his words had meant, how deeply his actions had impacted them. They told him about the changes they'd made in their lives, about the people they'd helped and the judgments they had chosen not to make. The old man listened quietly, his expression warm and approving, letting them speak without interruption. When they finished, he nodded, a look of pride in his eyes. "I'm glad to hear that," he said softly. "It's not always easy to see past the surface, but when you do, it opens up a whole new way of understanding people. You're learning what it means to see with more than just your eyes, and that," he added with a knowing smile, "is a wealth that no one can ever take from you." The young men felt a surge of gratitude, realizing that the old man had not only changed their outlook, but had given them something that would last a lifetime. They knew that they would carry his lesson forward, that they would keep striving to be the kind of people who looked beyond appearances, who chose empathy and respect over judgment. With a final nod, the old man opened the door of his car, the familiar squeak echoing in the lot, and climbed in. He gave them one last look, a silent reminder of everything he had taught them, before driving away, his old car blending into the distance. The young men stood there, watching until he was out of sight, a quiet gratitude filling their hearts. They knew, without a doubt, that his wisdom would guide them for the rest of their lives, a priceless gift from a man who had seen the world differently and had shown them how to do the same. As the old man's car disappeared down the road, the young men remained standing in the parking lot, feeling the weight of the moment settle over them. They knew they had just witnessed something profound, something that went beyond words. Each of them was filled with a quiet sense of gratitude, and yet a strange, bittersweet feeling lingered. They realized that they might never see him again, that this final encounter might truly be the last. But his presence, his calm wisdom, and his gentle reminder of what mattered most had left a lasting mark that would stay with them forever. In the days that followed, they continued to carry the old man's lesson in their hearts. Whenever they felt the urge to judge or make fun, they remembered his words, the calm look in his eyes, the way he had spoken with such understanding and patience. It became a part of their daily lives, shaping the way they interacted with others, the way they viewed the world. The change was so gradual that they didn't notice it themselves, but everyone around them saw it clearly. One day, they were sitting together at the diner, now known as their usual meeting spot, when a young woman walked in with a worn-out bag slung over her shoulder and clothes that had clearly seen better days. She looked tired, worn down, and uncertain, glancing around as if expecting judgment from the people inside. The young men noticed the way some customers looked at her with faint disapproval, their eyes scanning her with that familiar, dismissive look. Without hesitation, the group exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. They called her over, inviting her to sit with them, surprising her with their kindness. She hesitated at first, her face showing a mix of doubt and surprise, as though she couldn't quite believe that these well-dressed young men would welcome her to their table. But their smiles were genuine, and eventually she took a seat, her posture relaxing bit by bit. They asked her about her day, about her life, listening with genuine interest and respect. Slowly she opened up, sharing bits and pieces of her story, and as she spoke, they began to understand her struggles, her hardships, and the strength it took for her to keep going. She was more than her appearance, more than the tired clothes and worn bag she carried. She had dreams, hopes, and a quiet resilience that mirrored their own newfound wisdom. The young men felt a warmth in their hearts, a sense of fulfillment they hadn't known before. By extending kindness, they were living out the lesson the old man had taught them. They were choosing to see beyond the surface, to value people for who they were, not for what they owned or how they looked. And in doing so, they felt a sense of purpose, a quiet satisfaction that was worth more than any material reward. As they continued to meet people and share kindness, word of their generosity and open-mindedness began to spread. People in the community started looking up to them, seeing them as examples of respect and humility. Friends and neighbors would often approach them, eager to hear more about the old man who had inspired such a change in them. His story became a local legend, a tale of an ordinary-looking man with extraordinary wisdom, who had walked into their lives, left a few words of advice, and changed them forever. But for the young men, the change went deeper than just kindness to others. It changed the way they saw themselves. They found they no longer needed to put on a front, to act a certain way to gain respect. They were comfortable with who they were, just as the old man had shown them to be. They understood that their worth didn't depend on flashy cars, expensive clothes, or the opinions of others. It was rooted in the choices they made, in the respect they showed, in the quiet confidence that came from within. Over time, each of them carried the old man's lesson in different ways. Some went on to become mentors to younger kids in the community, teaching them the value of respect and kindness. Others volunteered, helping those in need, quietly showing empathy to people who were often overlooked. They knew that by passing on the old man's wisdom, they were honoring his memory, keeping his legacy alive. Years passed, and the group remained close, bound by the shared experience that had shaped them. Every now and then, they would meet at the diner, remembering the day that had changed everything. They would speak of the old man, sharing new insights about his words, always finding something deeper in the lesson he had left them. And though he was gone, they felt his presence, as if he were still watching over them, proud of the men they had become. And so, the lesson lived on. A legacy of kindness, humility, and understanding that reached far beyond those few minutes in the diner. It became a part of the community, woven into the lives of the people the young men touched. And in this way, the old man's wisdom spread, touching hearts and changing lives. A quiet reminder that sometimes the greatest riches lie not in what we own, but in how we choose to see and treat those around us. As the years continued to pass, the young men, now grown, with families and careers of their own, looked back on that transformative encounter with even greater clarity. Life had taken them in different directions, yet the bond between them remained unbreakable, forged by a shared lesson that only seemed to deepen with time. Whenever they faced challenges or moments of self-doubt, they found themselves remembering the old man, his quiet strength, and the simple yet profound wisdom he had imparted. One evening they gathered again at the diner, their old haunt now with children of their own joining them at the table, laughing and chatting. The place was still the same, with its familiar booths, the sound of sizzling food from the kitchen, and the comforting hum of conversation filling the air. But the young men who had once been so quick to judge had grown into fathers, mentors, and respected members of the community, admired for the values they quietly embodied. Their children, sensing that this gathering was somehow special, noticed the way their fathers glanced at the old booth by the window, exchanging nostalgic smiles. Curious, one of the kids finally asked, "Dad, what's so special about that booth? You guys keep looking at it." The men exchanged looks, each of them realizing that this was a moment they had unknowingly been waiting for, the chance to pass on the story that had shaped them. Smiling, one of the men began to tell the tale, starting with that seemingly ordinary day, the old man's beat-up car, the laughter, the mocking. He described how they had judged him so quickly, only to be left humbled and speechless when they saw him step out of a private jet the next morning. The children listened, wide-eyed, as their fathers recounted every detail, sharing the words the old man had spoken, the silent power he had carried, and the quiet lesson he had taught them. They heard how he'd shown them that dignity didn't come from wealth or status, but from self-respect, from treating others with kindness and compassion, and from understanding that true worth was something no one could see at first glance. As they finished the story, the men saw their children's expressions change, reflecting awe, respect, and maybe even a hint of pride. They could tell that the story had struck a chord, that it was planting a seed of understanding in these young minds, just as it had once done for them. They didn't expect their children to fully grasp it now, but they knew that one day life would bring them situations where they'd remember the story, where the old man's words would guide them in ways both big and small. The men sat back, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing they had passed on something invaluable, a story that wasn't just about them, but about timeless values, about seeing beyond the surface, about honoring the dignity in everyone. Before leaving, they took one last look at the booth by the window, filled now with a bittersweet sense of nostalgia and gratitude. They had no doubt that the old man's lesson would continue to ripple outward, affecting lives they would never even know. And as they left the diner, walking together with their families by their sides, they felt the comforting presence of his legacy, living on, steady as ever, carried forward by the hearts and minds he had touched. In the end, they understood that the old man's greatest wealth had not been his jet, his money, or any material possession. His true legacy was in the lives he had changed simply by being himself, by embodying values that were beyond measure. And though he was no longer there, his influence was woven into their lives, a quiet strength that would endure across generations, reminding each of them to look a little deeper, to judge a little less, and to love a little more. As the years continued to roll on, the story of the old man and his lesson became a cherished memory within the town, a tale passed down through families, shared with friends, and retold at gatherings. The young men who had once mocked him had now grown into pillars of the community, known not just for their kindness, but for the quiet wisdom they imparted to everyone they met. They had become mentors, teachers, and role models, guiding those around them not with loud words or flashy displays, but with gentle actions and an unwavering respect for every person they encountered. The town itself began to change, influenced by the example set by these men and those who followed their lead. People became slower to judge and quicker to lend a hand. Neighbors helped one another more, and small gestures of kindness became commonplace. Newcomers would notice this spirit of warmth and humility, sensing that something special was woven into the fabric of the town, though they couldn't quite put a finger on it. But those who knew the story would smile, aware that this culture of kindness could be traced back to a single encounter on a sunny morning years ago, when a humble man had chosen to teach a lesson without even meaning to. The young men, now middle-aged, often gathered at the diner, each reunion filled with the warmth of shared memories. They had all traveled different paths. Some were business owners, others were public servants, and one had even become a teacher at the local school, where he made a point of passing on the old man's lesson to his students. At their gatherings, they would sometimes sit in silence, watching the world go by, quietly reflecting on how different their lives might have been if they had never met him. They understood, more deeply than ever, that true wealth lay in the lives they touched, in the compassion they showed, and in the legacy they would leave behind. One fall, the town held a special event, a celebration of community values. They gathered in the park, under the golden leaves, where people shared stories of kindness, resilience, and integrity. Each family contributed something unique, and the town felt like a big family itself, each person connected by threads of empathy and shared history. One of the young men, now older and grayer, stood up to speak. He told the crowd about the old man, about the lesson they had learned so long ago, and about how that single moment had inspired an entire community. The audience listened with rapt attention, many nodding, some wiping away tears as he spoke. The children in the crowd watched, wide-eyed, as they took in the tale. The speaker paused, glancing around at the faces, and ended with words he knew the old man would have approved of. We all have the power to see people for who they are, not for what they own or what they show to the world. And when we look beyond the surface, we find a wealth that can't be counted in dollars or measured in status. That's the lesson he left with us, and that's the legacy we carry forward. After the event, many people approached him, sharing their own stories of kindness. of moments when they'd chosen to judge a little less or offer a little more, inspired by the tale of the old man. Young parents spoke of teaching their children the value of humility and respect, while elderly residents shared memories of the town's transformation over the years. It was clear that the old man's legacy had become a part of the town's identity, a quiet but powerful force shaping lives for the better. The years continued to pass, and life went on, bringing with it both joy and hardship. The young men, now older and wiser, eventually became grandfathers, each blessed with a family who looked up to them as examples of integrity and kindness. And in each family, the story of the old man was retold, becoming a sort of family heirloom, a piece of wisdom handed down with love and reverence. Grandchildren would listen to the tale with fascination, picturing the scene in their minds: the beat-up car, the mocking laughter, the stunning arrival of the private jet. To them, the old man became a kind of hero, a mysterious figure who had shown their grandfathers the true meaning of wealth and respect. One evening, as the oldest of the men sat on his porch, his grandson climbed onto his lap, asking him to tell the story of the wise man with the old car once more. The old man smiled, his eyes crinkling with warmth as he began, his voice carrying the familiar tale into the quiet evening air. He described how he and his friends had laughed at the stranger, only to be humbled by his dignity and grace. And as he spoke, he noticed his grandson listening intently, his young eyes wide with wonder, as though hearing the story for the first time. When he finished, the boy was silent for a moment, lost in thought. Then he looked up, his face serious, and asked, "Grandpa, do you think I'll ever meet someone like him?" The old man chuckled softly, patting his grandson's head. "Well, maybe you will, or maybe you won't," he replied. "But here's the thing. You don't have to wait for someone to show you how to live with kindness and respect. You can start right now with the choices you make, the way you treat people, and the way you see the world." That's the real lesson he left with us. You carry it in your heart and it will guide you, just like it guided me. The boy nodded, a look of determination crossing his face, and as they sat together, grandfather and grandson, under the stars that had witnessed generations before them, it became clear that the old man's legacy was secure. It would live on, not just in the lives he had directly touched, but in the countless lives that would be shaped by his story. A tale of humility, kindness, and the unbreakable strength that comes from living a life of quiet dignity. In the end, he had been right all along. True wealth wasn't measured by what we own or how others see us. It was the lives we touch, the hearts we change, and the legacy of love and respect we leave behind. And in this way, the old man's story would live on, timeless and true, echoing through the lives of those who chose to carry it forward, a gift that would never fade. Years later, the town itself seemed to hold the old man's spirit, as if his influence had seeped into its very foundations, becoming part of the community's identity. Generations grew up hearing about him, the man who had taught a lesson without ever meaning to, simply by living with a humility and strength that left an indelible mark. He was remembered not just as a story, but almost as a presence, someone whose values were still felt in the way people treated one another. His story had become a part of the town's shared memory, a tale that was whispered to children, repeated by parents, and reflected in the daily actions of those who knew it well. The men who had once mocked him were now elders in the town, each a respected figure who had built a life on the foundation of that one encounter. They had used his lesson as a guide, shaping their choices, relationships, and approach to life. One had become a respected business owner who treated every employee like family, no matter their position or background. Another was a teacher who dedicated his life to nurturing his students, teaching them to look beyond appearances and respect each other for who they were. A third served as the town's mayor, known for his fairness, his integrity, and his commitment to creating a community where everyone was valued. Their lives were a testament to the old man's influence, woven with purpose, dignity, and a sense of justice that had taken root on that day so many years ago. Over time, the town grew, attracting new families and young professionals looking for a close-knit, welcoming place to call home. Yet, even with new faces and fresh perspectives, the heart of the town remained unchanged. It was a place where people held doors for each other, greeted neighbors with warmth, and took pride in small acts of kindness. Every summer, the town hosted an annual festival in the park, a celebration of community and friendship where families gathered for music, games, and laughter under the open sky. As part of the festival, there was a special ceremony to honor the values that the town held dear, a tradition that had been inspired by the legacy of the old man. At this ceremony, one of the elders would stand before the crowd and recount the story, reminding everyone of the lesson in humility and compassion that had shaped the community. Children would listen, captivated, as the elder described how the old man had arrived in a beat-up car, only to reveal himself later as someone of great wealth and wisdom. Parents would glance at each other knowingly, understanding the deeper message, the reminder that true greatness lies not in possessions, but in character. And each year, as the story was retold, it was as if the old man was there, watching from the shadows, his quiet strength still guiding the town. One year, as the festival was coming to an end, a young woman approached one of the elders who had known the old man. She had recently moved to the town and had heard the story for the first time. There was a look of curiosity in her eyes, mingled with a sense of wonder, as though she were beginning to understand something profound. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice soft. "Did he really change the whole town with just a few words?" The elder smiled, nodding slowly. "Yes," he replied. "He didn't set out to change us. He simply showed us what mattered through his actions, his silence, and his patience. Sometimes the greatest lessons don't need to be taught, they only need to be shown." The young woman pondered this, her gaze drifting to the families gathered in the park, laughing and talking, each interaction touched by a warmth that seemed woven into the air. She saw children helping each other with games, teenagers assisting the elderly, and neighbors sharing food and laughter. The town had something special, something she hadn't seen before, a sense of unity and respect that transcended differences, a quiet dignity that was rare in most places. And as she looked around, she realized that the story of the old man was more than just a tale. It was a way of life, a shared commitment to seeing each other beyond the surface, to valuing each person for who they were. The old man's legacy was alive, not in monuments or plaques, but in the way people cared for one another, in the kindness that was exchanged with every greeting, every helping hand, every act of compassion. Months later, the young woman found herself facing her own challenge. She was running for a position in the town council, eager to contribute to the community she had come to love. But as she prepared her campaign, she encountered resistance from others who felt she hadn't lived in the town long enough to truly represent it. Rumors spread, questions about her loyalty surfaced, and for the first time, she felt the sting of judgment that many in the town had once felt. Remembering the old man's story, she took a different approach. She met each challenge with quiet strength, refusing to engage in arguments or respond to criticism. She worked harder, spending time with families, getting to know her neighbors, showing them through her actions that she cared deeply about the community. She remained calm, patient, and steady, choosing to let her actions speak for her rather than defending herself with words. Over time, people began to notice her sincerity, her commitment, and her unwavering respect for the town's values. In the end, she won her place on the council, not by proving herself in loud declarations, but by living out the lessons she had learned from the old man's story. She became known as a voice of fairness and compassion, someone who valued every resident and took the time to understand them. And so the legacy of the old man continued to spread, touching lives in new and unexpected ways. Generations passed, but the spirit of the old man lingered in the town, his lesson like a quiet, enduring song that played in the background of daily life. Children grew up hearing his story, young adults carried it with them into the world, and the elders ensured it was never forgotten. It became a compass for the community, a gentle reminder that no matter how the world outside changed, the values of respect, humility, and kindness would always be the foundation of their town. In the twilight of their years, the original group of young men who had once mocked him gathered one last time at the diner. Their faces were lined with age, their bodies slower, but their hearts were still full, bound by that single, extraordinary encounter. They sat together, each lost in memory, silently acknowledging the journey they had taken. They knew that they had been blessed, not just by the old man's wisdom, but by the chance to live out his lesson, to pass it on, and to see it flourish in the lives of those who came after them. As they rose to leave, they shared a knowing look, a quiet understanding that needed no words. They walked out of the diner together, each step filled with gratitude, each heartbeat carrying the legacy of a man who had changed them forever. The old man's story was now theirs, as much a part of them as the air they breathed, a gift they would carry into eternity. And as they walked home under the evening sky, they felt his presence, steady, timeless, and true, guiding them, reminding them that they were never alone, that his lesson would live on in every life they touched, forever. As the last of the original group of young men grew older, the town itself had aged gracefully alongside them, yet it remained as vibrant as ever. The small, tight-knit community had expanded, welcoming newcomers from all walks of life, each drawn to the town's reputation as a place where kindness was a way of life. Many of these newcomers arrived knowing only fragments of the story about the old man. They heard whispers of his legacy in the warm welcomes they received, in the way neighbors helped one another, in the genuine care with which people interacted. The old man's influence had become a quiet undercurrent, guiding the town's values even when his story was no longer told every day. One winter, a new family arrived, seeking a fresh start in the small, welcoming town. They came from a larger city, where the pace was fast, the neighbors distant, and the sense of connection scarce. The father of the family, Mr. Lewis, was a reserved man who rarely let his guard down. He had always believed in self-reliance, in proving oneself, in staying guarded against a world he saw as unforgiving. But here, he sensed something different, though he couldn't yet name it. One evening, as he walked through town, he noticed the familiar sight of families gathering at the diner. It was bustling, yet everyone seemed to know one another. Smiles and laughter filled the air, and people shared food, stories, and even personal struggles without hesitation. Mr. Lewis found himself drawn to the scene, watching from a distance, feeling both a yearning to belong and a reluctance to let his guard down. Just as he was about to turn and leave, one of the townsfolk waved him over, inviting him to join their table. Caught off guard, he hesitated, his instinct telling him to decline. But something about the invitation, a simple, friendly gesture, compelled him to stay. He took a seat, unsure, feeling slightly out of place. Yet the people welcomed him without a hint of reservation, sharing stories and asking about his life, his family, his plans in the town. No one pressed him, no one judged. It was as if they saw him, truly saw him, without the walls he had built around himself. As the conversation continued, someone at the table began to tell a story, one Mr. Lewis had not yet heard. It was about a humble, quiet man who had once arrived in town in a beat-up car, and how a group of young men, in their arrogance, had mocked him, assuming they understood all there was to know about him. Mr. Lewis listened intently, captivated by the tale as it unfolded, by the humility, the strength, and the dignity the old man had shown. The storyteller's voice softened as he described the private jet that had stunned the onlookers the following day, how the old man had redefined what it meant to be wealthy, not in possessions but in character and grace. The story struck a chord deep within Mr. Lewis. He felt the weight of his own assumptions, his tendency to see the world in terms of self-protection rather than connection. It was as if the story were speaking directly to him, challenging him to reconsider his view of people, of community, of himself. He remembered times when he had judged others too quickly, moments when he had dismissed kindness as weakness, and yet, here he was, surrounded by a community who lived by the very values the old man had taught. When the story ended, silence lingered over the table, each person lost in their own thoughts, feeling the power of the lesson once more. One of the older men at the table, his voice steady and full of warmth, turned to Mr. Lewis and said, "This town isn't just a place to live, it's a place to belong. And here we believe that wealth is what you carry in your heart, not in your wallet. That's the legacy of the old man. You don't need to have known him to live out his lesson. It's a gift for everyone who chooses to call this place home." Mr. Lewis felt a lump form in his throat, realizing just how much he'd been searching for a sense of belonging, though he had never been able to admit it before. And in that moment, he decided he would let his guard down just a little. He would let himself be part of this community, to be open, to trust that he could give and receive kindness without fear. In the months that followed, Mr. Lewis embraced his new life in ways he never expected. He became an active part of the community, lending a hand at events, getting to know his neighbors, and sharing stories over coffee at the diner. And as he did, he felt himself change, his heart softening, his perspective shifting. He no longer saw kindness as something to be wary of, but as a strength, a binding force that held the community together, just as it had held together the lives of those who had once learned from the old man. Eventually, Mr. Lewis began sharing the old man's story with others who came to town, just as it had once been shared with him. Each time he told it, he felt its wisdom settle deeper into his own heart, reminding him that the greatest wealth in life was the love, respect, and understanding we show to each other. He became part of the town's legacy, helping to carry forward a tradition that had started long before he had arrived, but was now as much a part of him as it was of anyone else. And so the story of the old man continued to ripple outward, touching lives, inspiring kindness, and creating a lasting legacy that grew stronger with each generation. It became woven into the fabric of the town itself, a quiet, enduring presence that reminded everyone of the power of humility, the strength of character, and the beauty of seeing others, not for what they appeared to be, but for who they truly were. In this way, the old man's lesson lived on, not as a fading memory, but as a guiding light, illuminating the hearts of those who chose to embrace it, carrying them forward into a future shaped by respect, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds of a community that had come to understand the true meaning of wealth. And even though he was long gone, his spirit remained, watching over the town, smiling quietly, knowing that his legacy would endure, generation after generation, in the hearts of those who chose to see the world through the lens of kindness and love. As years turned into decades, the story of the old man evolved into a cherished town tradition, passed from one generation to the next with a reverence usually reserved for folklore. Children learned about him in school, where teachers would weave his story into lessons about respect, empathy, and understanding. His name, though never fully known, became a symbol of what the town stood for, an embodiment of humility and the strength of character that had come to define the community. One spring, as the town prepared for its annual community festival, the organizers decided to honor the old man's legacy in a way that would forever connect the past to the present. They announced plans for a statue, a simple, unassuming figure sitting on a bench, representing the old man in his familiar, humble pose. The bench was placed near the town square, overlooking the diner, where so many generations had come to learn about his story. Though the statue was modest, it quickly became a beloved landmark, a place where residents could pause, reflect, and share his lesson with others. On the day the statue was unveiled, townspeople gathered in the square, young and old alike, each with a unique connection to the story. Parents brought their children, who craned their necks, eager to see the statue up close. Elders watched with knowing smiles, their memories of the old man's lesson fresh in their minds. The statue was not grand or elaborate. Instead, it captured his essence. A quiet, seated figure looking outward, as if he were still watching over the town, still there to remind them of what mattered most. The ceremony began, and several people from the community shared personal stories of how the old man's legacy had touched their lives. Some spoke of small acts of kindness they had performed or received, each a ripple from that original lesson. Others spoke of times when they had been quick to judge, but had remembered his story in time to change their perspective. One by one, they shared how the old man's influence had shaped their choices, their relationships, and their understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Finally, one of the last original young men, the few still alive who had actually met the old man, rose to speak. Now well into his twilight years, his face was marked with the wisdom of time and the quiet confidence that the old man had once embodied. His voice trembled slightly as he recounted that unforgettable day when they had laughed at the old man, only to be humbled by the arrival of the jet and the profound lesson that followed. His words were filled with gratitude, a lifetime's worth of respect for the man who had taught him, and his friends, the true meaning of wealth. He turned to the crowd, his gaze moving slowly over the faces of children, parents, neighbors, and friends, each one a testament to the legacy of kindness that had shaped the town. "The old man taught us that day that true wealth has nothing to do with money or status," he said, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "It's about how we treat each other. It's about the respect we show, the compassion we extend, and the humility we hold in our hearts. That's why this town has become what it is today, because we chose to live by his lesson." The crowd stood in silence, absorbing the weight of his words. Some were moved to tears, others nodded in quiet agreement, each one touched by the enduring power of the old man's legacy. In that moment, the community felt bound by an invisible thread, a shared commitment to live up to the values that had been passed down to them, generation after generation. After the ceremony, families lingered around the statue, children tracing their fingers over the figure's outstretched hands, as if seeking the wisdom it held. Parents took the opportunity to retell the story, encouraging their children to remember the lesson in their own lives. The statue became more than just a tribute. It became a place of reflection, a reminder to everyone who passed by of the strength that lay in humility and kindness. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the town square, people gradually dispersed, each carrying a renewed sense of purpose. But one little girl stayed behind, holding her grandmother's hand as she gazed up at the statue, her face filled with a quiet wonder. She looked up at her grandmother and asked, "Do you think he's still watching over us?" Her grandmother smiled softly, squeezing her hand. "I believe he is," she said. "Not just here," she touched her chest, "but in the hearts of everyone who remembers his story. He's part of us now, and as long as we choose to see others the way he saw us, he'll always be watching over this town." The girl smiled, feeling the warmth of her grandmother's words sink into her heart. She looked at the statue one last time as if making a silent promise to carry the lesson forward. Then, hand in hand, they walked away, leaving the old man's quiet figure in the square, bathed in the soft, golden light of dusk. In the days that followed, the bench and statue became a beloved gathering place where townsfolk would come to sit, reflect, or simply share a moment of peace. People left flowers at his feet, notes of gratitude tucked beneath his hands, and sometimes they even brought small stones or tokens, each one a symbol of their promise to live by his lesson. And as the seasons changed and the years continued to pass, the bench remained, a steady presence in the heart of the town, a testament to the legacy of a man who had given them all a gift beyond measure. In this way, his spirit lived on, not just in the memories of those who had known him, but in the choices, actions, and lives of everyone who embraced his lesson. The town continued to thrive, bound together by kindness, respect, and an unwavering commitment to honor his legacy. And though he had been gone for many years, his influence endured, woven into the fabric of the town's identity. A quiet reminder that true wealth could never be counted in dollars, but could be felt in the hearts of all who chose to live with love, humility, and a generous spirit. And so, the old man remained a silent guardian of the town, a beacon of the values that had made it a place unlike any other. Through every life touched, every act of kindness inspired, and every moment of compassion shared, his legacy continued to flourish, an unbreakable bond connecting the people to a deeper truth, a legacy of love that would endure for generations to come. In the years that followed, the bench and statue in the town square became a timeless fixture, a place where generations continued to meet, reflect, and share stories. The townspeople knew that the story of the old man was not just history, but a living legacy, one that each generation had a responsibility to carry forward. Children grew up hearing the tale at bedtime, learning that the measure of a person wasn't in what they owned, but in the kindness they showed. Teens found solace in the statue during moments of doubt, reminding themselves that they didn't need to prove their worth to anyone but themselves. And adults, especially those who faced the pressures of daily life, saw the statue as a grounding reminder of the values that truly mattered. Each year, the community held a small ceremony by the bench to honor his memory, a simple gathering where townsfolk shared their own experiences of how the story had touched their lives. These gatherings became a tradition, one that carried its own weight and meaning. People came forward to share personal accounts, moments when they had been inspired to help a stranger, times when they chose kindness over judgment, instances when they remembered his story and let go of anger or resentment. Each story was different, yet each one was part of the same tapestry, woven from the old man's lesson. One winter, on the anniversary of the statue's unveiling, the townspeople gathered once more, bundled in coats and scarves, braving the chilly air as they huddled near the bench. A young girl, no older than 10, stood beside the statue, her gloved hands wrapped around a small bouquet of wildflowers. She was there with her parents, but her gaze was fixed on the statue, her expression thoughtful and serious. She seemed deep in thought, as if contemplating something far beyond her years. As the ceremony began, people shared their stories as usual, each one heartfelt and genuine. When it was her turn, the little girl stepped forward, her eyes bright with a quiet understanding that belied her age. She spoke softly, but her words carried through the cold air, touching each person gathered around. "I never met him," she began, glancing at the statue, "but my mom and dad tell me about him all the time. They say he taught us to be kind, to see each other for who we really are, not just what we look like, and that even if people laugh at us or don't understand, it's okay, because we know what's in our hearts." The crowd listened in silence, each person feeling the purity and simplicity of her words. She continued, "I don't know if I'll ever be as wise as he was, but I want to try. I want to be someone who sees others like he did. I think that's what he'd want us all to do." With that, she placed the bouquet at the base of the statue, her small gesture embodying the sincerity and love that the old man had instilled in the town. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, and many wiped away tears, moved by the way the young girl had captured the heart of his message. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the snow-dusted square, the townspeople lingered, feeling the presence of the old man in the air around them. His legacy was alive, not in grand gestures or monuments, but in the simple, everyday kindnesses they showed one another, in the respect, humility, and empathy that had become the town's heartbeat. That evening, as families walked home, they carried with them the quiet joy of knowing that they were part of something greater than themselves. They were part of a legacy that transcended time, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The old man's story was no longer just his. It belonged to each of them, a guiding light that would shine through every generation that chose to remember him. And so, the statue remained in the square, a silent witness to the lives it touched, a symbol of the strength that lies in humility and love. People continued to visit it, leaving flowers, notes, and small tokens as a tribute to the man who had changed them all. And through every story told, every kindness extended, and every judgment withheld, his spirit lived on, forever intertwined with the town he had quietly transformed. In this way, His legacy became a thread woven through the fabric of the community, a legacy of grace, compassion, and the enduring power of seeing others with a gentle heart. It was a story that needed no ending, for as long as people chose to live by his example, his spirit would remain, a quiet reminder of the beauty that lies in simply being kind. As time drifted onward, the story of the old man settled into the town's history, not as a distant memory, but as an ever-present reminder of who they were and what they stood for. The statue by the diner remained, becoming weathered with age yet no less revered, a symbol of the timeless lesson he had given them. Generations passed, and while new residents came and old ones moved on, the heart of the town stayed the same, grounded in values that transcended the hands of time. Visitors who passed through often remarked on the town's unique spirit, its warmth, its openness. There was a sense of belonging that was rare in other places, an intangible feeling that one could sense as soon as they crossed into its borders. They might never hear the full story of the old man, yet they could feel the impact of his legacy in the welcoming smiles, the helping hands, and the way people looked out for one another. The townsfolk never let his story fade. Each year, as the festival came around and people gathered by the statue, new voices joined the ceremony, eager to share how his lesson had inspired them. Children grew into adults who embraced the values of kindness, humility, and respect, and they, in turn, taught these principles to their own children, ensuring that his legacy remained alive and vibrant. The old man's story had become a quiet inheritance, passed from heart to heart, and it formed a common bond that united everyone who called the town home. As the years rolled on, the town itself thrived, not with wealth or fame, but with the wealth of strong, enduring connections. People who grew up there often returned, feeling pulled back to the place that had shaped them. And with each returning soul, the town's legacy grew stronger, its foundation secured by the simple but powerful lesson the old man had once left behind. One crisp autumn day, a young child sat beside the statue, quietly listening to her grandmother tell the story. She watched as her grandmother's eyes filled with pride, her voice warm with remembrance, and she felt a deep sense of connection to the man she had never met. She glanced at the statue's calm, knowing expression, and in her heart made a promise to live by his lesson. For her, and for all who would follow, his story was not just a part of the past, it was a guide for the future. And so the old man's spirit continued to live on, not only in the memories of those who knew his story, but in the actions of everyone who chose kindness over judgment, humility over pride, and compassion over indifference. His legacy transcended the boundaries of the town, becoming a quiet force that rippled outward, touching lives far beyond its borders. In the end, the old man had given them something far more valuable than money or status. He had given them the gift of seeing others with an open heart, of valuing people not for what they had, but for who they were. And as long as they remembered him, as long as they carried his lesson within them, he would never truly be gone. His spirit, steady and unwavering, would forever watch over the town, a gentle reminder that true wealth lies in the kindness we show, the love we give, and the lives we touch along the way. And so, as the sun set over the town square and cast its warm golden light on the statue, the old man's legacy remained, a beacon of love, a testament to the quiet strength of a life well lived, and a story that would echo through time, inspiring countless hearts to see the beauty in each other forever. And to this day, the town continues to live by his quiet lesson, never judging by appearances and always choosing kindness, proof that sometimes a simple act can leave a legacy far richer than any fortune.